Welcome to TechieCastJax, where the top technology and business experts around discuss the latest trends in high tech. This podcast is hosted by Joe Holbrook, who's an experienced technologist pundit in Jacksonville, Florida.
Welcome aboard to TechieCast. Today we're going to go ahead and talk about Operations Suite, also known as Stackdriver. Now, Google has recently rebranded Operations from Stackdriver effectively. So it used to be called Stackdriver, now it's called Operations. Now, the suite of products that was basically called Stackdriver is now called Operations Suite. So just to clear that up, a lot of confusion out there. There didn't seem to be a lot of notification. It's like you woke up one day and they just changed the name without any real notification to the user base. It seemed like, at least that was my impression. So if you're taking any of the exams and you're wondering what the heck is cloud operations, well, you know that is Stackdriver. They are updating the documentation. It seems like some of the exams, though, haven't caught up, so it'll be Stackdriver on some of the exams, like the Cloud Architect, at least at the time of writing this podcast. Also, too, if you go to techcommanders.com, I have an article that details the Operations Suite and what it does and why you might want to use it and how it can help you as a cloud architect as well. Now, Operations Suite is a hybrid monitoring, logging, and diagnostics tool. It's meant for you to use this with Google Cloud and also with AWS to a degree. Now, pretty much everything with Operations Suite works pretty much natively without any issues with Google, of course. Now, with AWS, there's a little bit of a trick to monitor some of the EC2 instances, and that's another story for another day. But basically, it is a hybrid tool, and it can monitor certain aspects of AWS. So Google purchased Stackdriver and rebranded it to Google Stackdriver after the purchase a few years ago. And now they rebranded it now to Cloud Operations. So that's the history of Stackdriver. Cloud Operations basically monitors your service layers in a single SaaS solution. It effectively maintains native integration with Google Cloud and other tools such as BigQuery, Cloud Storage, Data Lab, you name it. It pretty much can do just about anything you want it to do when it comes to monitoring, logging, and diagnostics with Google Cloud. Now, in a nutshell, if you want to monitor, troubleshoot, or review your application performance, this is the tool to use with the Google Cloud. It is actually amazingly easy to use, and I have to say, I really had no issues, setting it up or monitoring anything, and pretty much that's, generally what you're probably going to run into, I would think. With cloud operations, there's a lot of great benefits. For example, if you wanted to go and just view how your VMs are operating or how that application is actually working in real time, this is going to help you. It has some great tools like diagnostics. It also has a stack tool as well we'll talk about. But with that said, Cloud Operations is really meant to provide you deep insight. It's dynamic, it's intelligent, you keep the metrics for as long as you want. Now, if you are taking any of the Google Cloud exams, they generally like to ask about what the Stackdriver metrics are. Basically, there's platform metrics, system, and application metrics. Now, generally, too, if you want to create alerts and all that, there's certainly plenty of documentation on how to do that. But when it comes to creating a view, one of the things we want to do is create a workspace. Now, a workspace is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically a view that you want to create so that you could view and manage the specific resources that you want to manage. So for example, when you create a workspace, you may have this project in there with specific instances, compute engine or any other service that you may be running. Set up your alerts, your uptime checks, create notification channels. So when it comes to workspace, basically every workspace would have a host project effectively. Now the workspace is going to be able to manage basically the projects from a monitoring perspective. We could also log as well, which is actually pretty cool. So it's all integrated. There's very little work to do. Now, when it comes to cloud operations, we could chart, basically. We could set up parameterized URLs. When it comes to monitoring, again, there's what's called Metrics Explorer. Metrics are basically going to be collected around what you're doing in your project. You could select, for example, compute engine. You could select, for example, cloud storage. You could select BigQuery, whatever you want to monitor. Now, when it comes to latency checks, for example, we create an uptime check. Basically, when we create an uptime check, it's going to just validate the latency basically between our different resources and regions and zones that we're using. Basically, we could show the uptime, we could have latency alerts, we could validate that they passed. We could also set up alerts to notify us with SMS, PagerDuty, a webhook, web apps that we tie into. It's our call. Now, when it comes to cloud logging, it's going to support pretty much any number of basically destinations that we want to set up. We could export them. There is a logging API that'll help your developers create that on-ramp to cloud operations and any other logging tools that they want to use. There are logging and monitoring agents. These are not needed if you don't really want to get, for example, deeper insight into, for example, your virtual machine activity. It does use, for example, FluentD. FluentD is an open source data collector. It's going to allow you to unify essentially the data collection and consumption, and therefore it allows you to get a better understanding from a holistic view. Now, FluentD is, of course, used as well to obtain and write log files to syslog and other log types. Now, one of the things that we can do is create a log sync. Now, why do we want to create a log sync? Well, effectively, a log sync is going to allow us to query against and also export as well. And we could do this via a gcloud command called gcloud logging syncs create. So we could set up these syncs effectively at the project level and also folders if we're using that if we have an organization. Now there's a ton of information to go into around permissions and retention. I'm going to have a link to this blog that I wrote again on Tech Commanders in the description. If that's of interest to anyone, feel free to look at it. It has a lot more detail. And when it comes to GKE, for example, Kubernetes engine, it can monitor GKE and there's also some discussion too around using the Kubernetes native monitoring, or do we use Stackdriver operation? Actually, I should say cloud operations now. But when it comes to GKE, that gives us, again, an additional choice. There is native integration with monitoring and logging, so we can do that. Now, there is, of course, Kubernetes monitoring that's enabled by default, and you can customize it. That, again, is another sort of discussion in itself. You know, easily talk 30 minutes on some of the points to be concerned with Kubernetes. Now, with error reporting, one of the things we could do is set up error reporting. So if there's an error, we're going to get notified. And that'll help us understand, again, that there's an issue and dive into the root cause. Now, there is also a cloud debugger. Now, debugger is going to allow us to inspect the state of an application, excuse me, at any code level. Now, what this means is that if we're developing an application or have developed an application and we want to capture and inspect basically the application packets, we don't actually have to stop the application. This is cool because it's going to allow us to capture the call stack and look at different variables of that running application. There's some really good demos on this online on YouTube. I encourage you to check it out as well. Now, Cloud Debugger does support various runtime environments like Java, Go, Python as well. And also, too, one of the things we could do with Debugger is basically use what's called a snapshot or a log point and run against it and basically use it as almost like a baseline. Now, we could also select the source code. We could use alternate source codes. We could go from Bitbucket or Cloud Source repositories, GitLab as well. So when we debug, it's going to capture the call stack and all the variables of that application. We could also inject logging as part of it. Now, on my article, I have the steps for debugging an application with some graphics in there to help give you an idea. I won't cover it on the podcast because, again, it's really hard to picture, commands and workflows. It's just easy to read a piece of paper. I'm sure it's hard to listen and do that. So on the podcast, this is more of an overview. Go to the article to help give you some more insight. Now, there is trace capabilities. This is one of my favorite capabilities because not only does it add to what debugger does, but it can also dive into the performance issues such as latency and bottleneck discovery issues. Now, trace is going to plot out basically over a period of time and let us know, for example, what is really going on from a latency perspective on that app. And we could analyze the results. So it's going to generate a graph and allow us to create a report. And then lastly, there's another capability that doesn't seem to get a lot of attention, but it is there. And it's meant for developers to analyze applications to look at the CPU or memory functions. It's basically going to provide heap analysis. It's going to look at the consumption of specific functions. So if we have issues around, for example, a CPU, it seems to be hanging, performance is just not easy to diagnose, Profiler gives you that ability to monitor the CPU continuously and profile the heaps to help you improve performance and also maybe reduce cost. But basically, it's going to look at the call hierarchy and resource consumption and put it together in this basically what is called a flame graph. And it's sort of interesting to see how an application actually reacts to specific activity. Sometimes you could develop an application and you may not realize that this specific request or this specific operation or function is just some reason making the CPU hang and you just can't figure it out. Well, Profiler is really meant to help you with that. Now, also too, this can be extended out to on-prem and other platforms. That's the cool part. So there's some great capabilities with cloud operations. So as part of the suite, remember, as far as Operation Suite itself, we have monitoring, logging, error reporting, trace, debug, and profiler capabilities. There's also, too, a great code lab that you could use to get deeper insight. And I always recommend you take it before you take any Google Cloud exam. It seems to be an area where that would be very helpful for test candidates to go through with the code lab, because it gives you an understanding of how these tools actually work. Now, for most of the Google Cloud exams, you don't need to know the deep areas like stacks or functions. It's more of why you want to use it and how it works from an oversight perspective. But the code lab will definitely help you if you don't have access to quick labs. So once again, go over to techcommanders.com, look at the blog. There's a link in the description as well. I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions. With that said, have a great day, and I look forward to talking to you again.